Welcome to the Dynamics of Everyday Life, where we demystify some tricky concepts and get to know ourselves a little bit better. Welcome back to the Dynamics of Everyday Life. As I prepare and produce this episode, we're in September, the time of year that is traditionally associated with the going back to school vibe. As a parent of school-aged children, this is the one time of year that I might have some of, if not all, my ducks in a row. If I'm given an instruction that one of them needs a matchstick model of Notre Dame by tomorrow morning, complete with gargoyles and flying buttresses, there's every chance that I might be able to whip one up. This won't last, however. Once I'm into October and things start getting booked in for the next few months, I won't have the headspace to be able to respond that quickly, as my mind will be too full of everything else. During the pandemic, everything slowed down, and there seemed to be this hope that we wouldn't let ourselves get so busy again. And yet somehow it seems that we're now even busier than before. How did this happen? And more importantly, what is the impact that it has on us? One of the big effects that it has on us is our ability and capacity to make decisions. In our lives, we're constantly bombarded with information, far more so than any other time in history. There's an unending amount of content out there, so much so that we'll never be able to consume it all in our lifetimes, and we can access it whenever we want. We used to have to wait to pay cheques into the bank, or to go to the supermarket when it was open. And if you sent off for something in the post, maybe you'd collected all the tokens from your Rice Krispies and were waiting for your Snap, Crackle and Pop stencil to arrive, you had to wait 28 days. Whilst the advent of next day delivery can be a marvellous thing, I'd never have got through parenting during the primary school years if it wasn't for Amazon Prime, it does create the expectation of immediacy. This gives us the illusion of having more time, and in theory it could. We don't have to wait for what we want, we can just do it. Need to pay a bill? Just hop onto your banking app and it's sorted. Which is great, but what we end up doing is pushing more and more into our minds, which doesn't give us the ability to think clearly anymore, especially when we spend all our time making choices about what to buy, read, eat and watch, to name just a few. If you've ever spent time scrolling through the menu on Netflix, you'll know exactly what I mean. Decision fatigue is different from mental fatigue. Mental fatigue is where we're tired from switching between activities. Maybe we've been multitasking, or just loading more and more projects onto our plate that require us to do some psychological work. Decision fatigue is where the quality of our choices become diminished because we've got too many decisions to make. It's a phrase that's become introduced into our vocabulary by American journalist John Tierney. From a psychodynamic perspective, it can be linked to ego depletion. Let's go back to Freud's structure of the mind here to help us understand this more. We've talked in previous episodes about us all having an ego. It's the part of our psychic structure that, according to Freud, relates to reason and common sense. For Freud, our minds are made up of the id, the ego and the superego. The id is the part of us that relates to the pleasure principle. It's all about us getting our needs met, whatever these might be. The id doesn't care about reality or other people. It wants what it wants. The superego is the part of us that relates to our moral conscience. It wants to keep us in check and tells us quite firmly what we should and shouldn't be doing. The ego is the part of us that deals with reality and common sense and moderates between the id and the superego. I like to think of it in terms of the characters in Scooby-Doo. Scooby and Shaggy correspond with id-type behaviour. They're all about getting their needs met, primarily around food and running away from ghosts and monsters. Fred and Daphne take on the superego role and are concerned with doing the right thing. And then we have Velma, who, as the ego, attempts to keep the peace between everyone else whilst dealing with the situation in hand. Going back to ego depletion, what we're thinking about here is that tasks such as willpower and self-control rely on mental supplies of energy. These can be exhausted when they're used constantly without a break. And when we get tired in this way, it means that we're likely to have less self-control. We can use the example of going supermarket shopping without a list. You walk up and down the aisles thinking whether you need something or not, and what you want to eat, sometimes thinking about what you should eat. You're constantly making choices throughout this trip, which could last up to an hour. By the time you get to the checkout, you're fed up with thinking about what you should or shouldn't be eating, and there in front of you is a large stand of chocolate. Now, if this large stand of chocolate had been at the front of the shop, chances are you'd have walked past it without stopping and thinking about the other things that you need to purchase. However, by the time you get to the end of your shopping, having had to make decisions for the last hour on what you'll eat when, possibly being a bit fed up at having to queue behind people who seem to be about to feed a small army with the amount of shopping that they're loading onto the conveyor belt, it's much more likely that you're going to reach for the family-sized bar of chocolate as a treat, because your willpower has been depleted. You feel like you deserve it. Or, in terms of the id, ego and superego, the ego is so tired from having to make appropriate choices throughout the trip that the id gets a chance to take over, and into your basket goes a large family-sized bar of chocolate. It makes sense why there are always treats near the tills, and this isn't just in food shops. Think about clothes shops where there are always goodies near the tills too. The amount of hair bubbles, socks and hand cream I've bought when queuing up to pay for something that I actually wanted is staggering. So if you get any of these for Christmas from me, you'll know what's happened. Decision fatigue can lead to other behaviours as well as impulse buying at the tills. We can find ourselves avoiding making decisions. In a very vacuous way, this occurs for me when choosing what colour I want to get my nails painted. I stare at the different swatches for far too long than is required and have been known to get my friend who is doing them to suggest something for me. The reason that this is because I tend to get them done in the evening, after a day of making decisions. By the time I get to see my friend, I'm done with making choices. It does make me wonder if I'd be any more decisive if I went first thing in the morning. On a more serious note, we can think that by avoiding making a decision, we're putting it off. But in reality, not making a decision is still making a choice. The question becomes whether we're making the decision not to make a choice consciously or unconsciously. It's a very different thing to decide that you'll make a decision on your situation at a later date than to deny that you're going to be making a decision at all. In the first situation, we're aware of what's happening. In the second situation, our defences have come out to play and we aren't letting ourselves think about it. This could be because we have some anxiety around making the decision, and we want to avoid feeling anxious at all costs, which is why we employ some denial. We can also see some decision fatigue creeping in when the decisions we're making have far-reaching impact and require a lot of critical analysis. There might be conflicts involved in the decision-making process. It might not be a simple task of deciding either or. There might be multiple scenarios to take into consideration. There may be many parties involved. This can all have an impact on the energy going into the ego and can result in us not being able to see clearly to make the appropriate decision. This reminds me of the expression where you can't see the wood for the trees. There's just too much going on. Which leads on to other possible outcomes of decision fatigue, and that's where we end up either making decisions quickly with no real thought behind them, and these may end up being influenced by our unconscious biases, or not being able to make a decision at all, because we just can't put the energy into making the decision, and so we don't do anything. My invitation to you this week is to consider in your life where you might be experiencing some decision fatigue. What impact is it having on you? In my earlier example of choosing my nail colour, it doesn't affect anyone that I can't choose this. My friend is well aware of my inability to pick, and so will often have some ideas up her sleeve. However, there are some decisions that have profound and life-changing impacts, and not just on us, but on the people around us too. So it can matter hugely how we're feeling when we make these decisions. How can you make life easier for yourself when you have big decisions to make? Can you take out some small decisions to give yourself the space to make the bigger decisions? What do you need to do to give yourself the psychological capacity to do this? And, as always, give yourself some grace here. You may have spent a long time berating yourself for your perceived inability to make decisions, when actually you just have too many to make in a day. Looking at ourselves at this level can be challenging and unnerving as we develop our awareness, so I'd always encourage that you do this at your own speed. If you feel you need some extra help around this, then I've put together a PDF resource sheet, and you can find the link for this in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Dynamics of Everyday Life. Please hit the follow button for future episodes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Instagram at The Dynamics of Everyday Life or find me on LinkedIn at Julia Rogers. I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on dynamics. The Dynamics of Everyday Life is brought to you by Coaching 42 and the fabulous team at the Podcast Boutique.